The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
So I'm here today in Leland. Is it pronounced Leland?
It's Leyland.
Leyland in the UK with Dame Sue Ion. Thank you so much for having me into your home. It's really an honor to be able to chat with you today.
You're most welcome, Bret. I'm happy to be able to talk to you.
So I have to address this up front. What does Dame mean exactly? Coming from America, I'm not familiar with the...
All right. Well, are you familiar with the concept of a Sir?
Like when someone's knighted, like yes. Sir Richard Branson or something?
Yes, exactly. Dame is the equivalent for women.
You were knighted, essentially.
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, that's a good question. I received a letter in the post saying that I've been recommended for the honour for my services to science and engineering. And I got to receive the honour at the palace by the Queen back in 2010.
That is amazing. I mean, you've had an interest in science from a very young age.
Yeah, I was always interested in science and things technical. Like I was the sort of person who wanted to help my dad out when he was building and making things. When I was at school, I always enjoyed the science subjects better than any of the others. And when it came to choosing subjects to do at university, I wanted to do something that had an applied focus to it. So I picked to do what was called at the time, material science and engineering.
Do you think that the people who go down that path are inherently more curious? Is it curiosity that's the common thread of people who pursue these scientific pursuits?
I think curiosity probably has something to do with it. Because I was interested in, as a small child, I was interested in things like astronomy and learning about the planets and that sort of thing. And I always was keen to understand how things worked. So it was trying to figure out, how things worked, how they were made. And that's common to a lot of people in the science and engineering world, whether they be boys or girls, men or women.
You took that curiosity and ended up really achieving technical expertise. What did you pursue?
Well, when I was at university doing the material science and engineering degree, we were able in our third year at university to choose what they called modules or options. So you could choose aerospace or electronics, and one of the modules when I did my degree was a nuclear module, and so I'd always been interested in things to do with the nuclear sector. Even at school, I liked that part of the what was called the A-level syllabus, which is the last thing you do in a UK school, and so I chose the nuclear option at university to have as my third year module.
At the time, how was nuclear viewed in society?
Well, at the time, it was viewed very positively. It was seen as, technologically advanced. It was seen as, the next cool thing to do and be involved in. So it was pretty popular back in the late 60s, early 70s.
So where did your early career start then?
Well, having as my PhD subject, I actually picked a topic that was relevant to the nuclear industry. Not because it was relevant to the industry per se, but because the material that I was studying happened to be of interest, and also it was the material that they used to clad the what's called the Magnox fuel elements that the UK used. So
right, because the UK actually pursued a slightly different type of, or not slightly, but a different type of reactor than the US in its early development.
That's true. I mean, the UK was heavily impacted by the McMahon Act, which was passed in the United States by Congress just after the Second World War, which meant that the US wasn't willing to share its nuclear technology anymore. So the UK wanted to continue to pursue nuclear topics, and so had to go its own way. And so it chose to develop what was called the Magnox technology at the time, because it used natural uranium. You didn't require an enrichment capability. And it had what it thought was a good design to get the program going, which it proved to have.
And so then the UK built out a whole fleet of these Magnox reactors.
Yeah, it did. And, the last ones only closed down in the, at the beginning of this last decade. In fact, Wilfer, the last ones closed down early this decade. But they ran very successfully for 50 odd years.
Yeah.
We got a lot of expertise and experience doing it. But they were really the first generation of reactors. They used metal fuel, which has limits in terms of the temperature you can run it at. And so from an efficiency standpoint, back in the 1960s, we realized we'd have to move to oxide fuel. But we had a great deal of expertise on gas-cooled systems. So we adopted for a gas-cooled reactor, which was called the AGR, the Advanced Gas-Cooled Reactor. And they became the workhorse of the UK's nuclear fleet, and they're still the reactors that operate today.
And so funny, on this trip, I've learned so much traveling around Europe and getting to understand the nuclear community here. Sometimes in the US, it's presented as if other types of reactors don't even exist, especially some of the advanced reactors that are coming along and trying to demonstrate all the advantages of their new technology. But in fact, the UK has pursued and developed advanced technology all along in the gas-cooled space.
Well, not just gas-cooled space. I do some lecturing now at my old college at Imperial College London on their Masters of Nuclear Engineering course. So I teach a bit of history of the UK's nuclear journey. We had a Heinz 57 approach to the technology back in the 1960s and 70s. We built pretty much one of everything going.
Yeah.
So not only did we have advanced gas-cooled reactors, we had a high-temperature reactor called Dragon that was based in the south of our country, and we had a steam-generating heavy water reactor, and we had 2 fast reactors. So sodium-cooled fast reactors. So we built quite a bit in the early days.
And then why do countries end up usually settling on one design? Is it for supply chain reasons? Or?
It's for economies of scale, learning from experience, realizing that if you've made what you'd call a good choice, then the technology you install lasts for many decades. I mean, I guess at the time the US built its light water reactor fleet, it probably didn't realize at the time that those units would last for the 40, 60 years that they are doing. Because they probably weren't designed with that design intent at the outset, but it turned out that they were robust enough to last that long and therefore get life extension. The UK, in its choice of reactors, and it chose the gas-cooled system, those reactors have a limited lifetime because of the lifetime of the graphite core. And so, can't last as long. So if we'd taken a decision back in the 1960s to go for light water reactors at the time, then those units would still be running well into the next 2 decades.
Wow. Instead
of us having to replace our fleet.
You said you'd worked on cladding in
yes, I did. Yeah.
Thesis. What were the topics there that you focused on? What was the challenge you're trying to solve?
The challenge I was trying to solve was the defamation characteristics of the clad. So that you understand how it performs as it's manufactured. Because the UK's clad was metal fuel, where it was what's called a soft clad. It was in close contact with the metal bars, the metal uranium bars, which were grooved. So the clad had to sit down in the grooves to make sure it moved with the uranium bars as they reached peak temperatures in the reactor. So it was understanding the defamation characteristics of the clad and the manufacturing route for the clad.
Did that focus area of yours translate to work in the commercial sector?
Yeah, it did. It was one of the reasons that I got the job that I did with what was then British Nuclear Fuels back in the late 1970s, early 1980s.
Is that where you started your career at British Nuclear Fuels?
I did, yes. That's
and
where
then you were there for quite a while, rising all the way up to the leadership positions.
I started off as what they called a technical support officer in their technical department, which supported all the production plants, and went through a number of jobs in the company.
What were some of those jobs?
Well, usually you start off as an individual technical person, and then you rise to managing a group of technical people, if you stay in the technical world, that is. So I managed and ran a team of people doing technical support and also looking at the next generation processes for a suite of new plants that were built to make fuel.
Next generation processes, what were some of those?
Well, just more modern technology to make what was the then oxide fuel. So pelleting and granulation, similar to the sort of tools and techniques that the pharmaceutical industry uses routinely. So getting us up to 21st century capacity and understanding in those manufacturing routes. And I also had a stint in the sales and marketing of the products, because we didn't just make fuel for the UK. We actually sold intermediate products internationally to countries like Sweden, Japan, Spain. So when you're in sales and marketing in the nuclear world, you actually have to have some technical knowledge and know-how as well. Right. Otherwise, the customers don't think you're credible. So you require the technical base to be able to go and sell the products to the customers.
So I already see some diversity in your experience there. But people must have seen excellence in your performance that got you to that next level.
I guess, yeah. I guess that must have been true. So, having done that stint, I actually in the UK sometimes our chief exec and board members, they have what are called special assistants, technical assistants, people who they think might make senior positions at some point. And you basically, follow them for a year and sit in board meetings, in government meetings, in customer meetings, understand how the company works and write all the briefing material. So you gain a lot of knowledge about the industry and about how the company works. And then after that year, I was given the job of being head of R&D for our fuel division. And then 2 years later, technical director for the whole of the company.
R&D for the fuel. What were some of the areas of research that how do you refer to it? British Nuclear Fuels? Or you say BNF, or how do you say?
At the time, it was BNFL.
BNFL.
So it's British Nuclear Fuels Limited.
BNFL. What were some of the areas of research that were of interest to them?
Some of the areas of research were new manufacturing processes that were what's called dry processes as opposed to wet chemical processes. Improvements to the cladding material to make it more oxidation resistant, development of new profiles for the cages that hold the fuel so that the reactor performance is more efficient, that sort of thing. And then and I guess just adoption of more modern processing tools and techniques and making sure their impact on that they didn't have any negative impact on the product, because even if the product's made in a different way, you still have to assure it against specific design criteria. So if you change the processing route, you have to be able to demonstrate that the product itself is still as it should be and as it always was.
How did the scope increase though as then you moved to technical director of the whole company?
Well, technical director of the whole company, it wasn't just fuel, it was reprocessing, and it was a multi-site job. So, from going from around about 200 people under my wing, at peak I had closer to 800 to 900 people on more than one site. So I was responsible for the whole of the reprocessing and waste management and decommissioning development, as well as the fuel development.
Can we dive into waste management and decommissioning, maybe actually even take them as separate issues. I'm still trying to wrap my head around how to see those topic areas, because a lot of money is directed towards them. A lot of emphasis is put on them, but I also have trouble reconciling that emphasis in relation to other industries, which also create chemicals that are hazardous to human health and don't put comparable effort in, and maybe put 1/100th of the cost and effort into working with those materials. Can you maybe kind of help me understand how to think about waste and decommissioning?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the nuclear industry has some special issues associated with it in people's perception. Because its original genesis back in the military era, where nuclear technology was used for weapons purposes, not for energy generation, then there's an issue always in people's minds about the danger associated with nuclear fallout, nuclear weapons. So radiation and nuclear are something that many people are inherently worried about. And those concerns, as a sector and as governments, we've been pretty poor at addressing why people should be so concerned and how to give the evidence that would help to alleviate those concerns. Because if you took, for instance, the fairly recent disaster at Fukushima in Japan, the disaster was the tsunami which wrecked the whole of the eastern seaboard of Japan, wiped out tens of thousands of people and many industries, including heavy chemical, automotive, the works. And yet almost all the focus was on the reactors that happened to have been impacted as well.
Yeah.
And yet the safety issues arising from the reactors were negligible in the overall scheme of things.
Right.
And, anybody, the very tiny numbers of people who died because of, something falling on them or drowning or something like that, not because of radiation. And yet tens of thousands of people who were just on the eastern seaboard died.
Yeah.
And there was a great deal of obsession about radiation. More so in other countries. Here in the UK, not so, because we did a very good evidence-based discussion on the topic that the media were pragmatic for once about, and the fact that we don't get tsunamis here. So people's concerns about the nuclear sector, apart from a peak for a couple of days, actually didn't really affect it at all. But that was one issue where, just to give an example of why, the fact that there's a permanent focus on nuclear stuff as hazardous. So the inherent worry that people have, that we've done very little to turn around or address. The fact that in the early days of the nuclear power industry, people were, particularly if you were reprocessing, where you've got big radiochemical plants, when people designed them, they didn't think about minimizing wastes at the outset, and they didn't think about how they were going to decommission them in the end. And so the plants that were built as prototype plants in the UK, in France, in the United States, in Russia, nobody thought about the long term of how they were going to sort them out. And with hindsight, and it's always great to look with hindsight, things could have been a lot better, because, all of those nations face quite a large, what we call legacy cleanup issue, because you've got all the prototypic plants that weren't designed for easy decommissioning, and wastes that, because the programs were all implemented very quickly to get the power plants online, waste just left in silos, ponds, tanks, to be dealt with later, when maybe if it had been thought through more carefully, better planning, better design at the outset would have made the job easier. So if you talk to people like me now, I would always say that the new plants that are designed, whether they be reactors or any form of processing plant, now they are designed to minimize waste and to be readily decommissioned. And what we're having to deal with, and what the media and the public and the politicians concentrate on, is the legacy that we have to deal with because it's there. And it's very challenging from an engineering standpoint. But we're the most heavily regulated sector globally. Maybe the aerospace sector is also heavily regulated because it's safety critical. Nobody wants a plane to fly if it's not safe.
Right.
But similarly, the nuclear sector, internationally, nobody wants a plant to operate or an action to be taken if it's not safe. So the big waste management issue is how to safely move sludges, old cladding, fuel into a safe form, which can be then stored for many hundreds of years. Now, your question was, what about other industries? It is odd that we're the only industry that is required to look at managing and packaging our wastes and guaranteeing their safety, not just for hundreds of years, but for thousands of years. When people willingly throw, mercury, cadmium,
right,
all sorts into their, waste bins and let them get taken away to landfill. All the batteries that you throw away have got toxic chemicals in them. I mean, there's more efforts being made to recycle now, but still, there's loads of stuff that just goes straight to landfill and nobody thinks about it.
I mean, if I ate a battery, I would probably die first. If I ate a battery or the equivalent amount of uranium, I'd probably die first with the battery. Or
probably, yeah, because some
or maybe that's not a very accurate way to look at it.
I mean, certainly, things like uranium, they're heavy metals, so right. they are toxic because they are heavy metals, rather than because of radioactivity. Clearly, once things have been in a reactor, other elements are produced that are more radioactive
right.
than the source material.
But I guess I'm wondering, and maybe I'm just kind of pushing too hard in this direction, but if society accepts us just tossing hazardous chemicals in a landfill and putting a fence around it, i.e. batteries, it seems like that would be an equally technically sound way to deal with spent fuel if it's of equal toxicity, or if it's
I mean, spent fuel has got high toxicity because of the fission products that are contained within it. But I think that's where proportionality comes in terms of the I wouldn't suggest that you have no regulation, absolutely not.
Right.
But just that when you look at the absolute risk to people, why are we moving to geological disposal for radioactive material, and it has to be guaranteed safe for thousands of years. And also from a fuel standpoint, I just think that fuel, once it's come out of a reactor, is 96-97% recyclable, and yet we're the only sector where recycling is questioned because of the other issues associated with reprocessing and recycling. But it's an absolutely incredible, valuable energy resource, and to think about trying to put it in forms where it's extremely difficult to get at for thousands of years. In a few generations' time, those who look back on this era will be thinking, how crazy were they? Yeah. We've run out of oil. Other fossils are in short supply. All the hope for benefits of solar and other technologies, we're running into a resource limited world. So all the materials that you need to make those sort of things, they're running out too. Where are we going to get our energy from?
Right. I'm worried about. You can make something cost. If I tell you that you have to take care of something for 10,000 years versus 1,000 years, I could run up the price tag to make it twice as expensive. If I tell you then it has to go for 1 million years, I might make the price tag for something astronomical. Yes, there's always an engineering way to make it happen. But the cost of that, it just seems to me that...
Well, I mean, it may not be, that difficult in terms of engineering robustness. The bigger issue is the place you choose to site it, which nearly always raises, huge issues in political space and in public acceptability space. Even though it's entirely possible and credible, it's well, yes, of course we need a geological repository, but we don't want it here. Right. Even though you can show me that in an engineering sense and a geological sense, it would be safe for the period that you need it to be safe over, I still don't want it here. Yeah. Put it somewhere else. And you end up into an argument with, my area's less safe than your area, so you can't put it here. When in practice, either is probably okay, because you can engineer things to last for hundreds, thousands of years. It's not an unachievable task in engineering space. It currently appears to be a very difficult challenge in public and political acceptability space, which is why the issue of risk and proportionality and understanding, it's so essential that is addressed over the coming decades in a much better way than it has been hitherto.
So how do we address that in a better way?
Well, if there was an easy answer to that, I wouldn't be having the conversation with you now. It is very difficult, but some of it is down to people responding emotionally rather than from an evidence base. But that's always true. We're human beings. We're always going to respond emotionally. But some of it must surely also be down to education, starting right at the bottom, and to make sure that proper information is made available from first stage schooling all the way through to university and beyond, and that the teachers who teach are also well informed, that the parents are informed, that their grandparents are informed, so that society isn't driven to make decisions on the basis of pure emotion, when if they actually were able to have a better understanding, they might make a different decision. But it's very difficult.
How does the coal industry get away with it? How do they think about risk, or how they communicate risk to the public?
Oh, well, I guess it's because we live in a different era now from the era where coal as a resource, an energy resource, and mining was initiated, way back, hundreds of years ago. And people, people grew up working in terrible conditions in mines, whether they be coal or tin or gold or whatever. Mining is not an attractive place to have a career, or wasn't. And yet it was perfectly acceptable. When things like pit closures were announced because the resources were no longer economic, it was a tragedy, and people were desperately sorry in the communities because they weren't no longer available for work. And yet the human cost in terms of damage to those who actually worked was tremendous. So we live in a different era, Bret, where there's a much more information available to people off social media, off the internet. Not all of it accurate. And so you just can't live like you did 100 years ago. So
what we have to do is we have to kind of relook at our communication strategy with the filter of the present in mind.
Yeah. And also to try and be, to look at all options. No energy options are perfect. So it's no good saying that, wind is the perfect solution. When it doesn't blow, it isn't. Same with solar. And so you look at things like interim storage and the massive resource required in battery technology, huge resource required to bring that about.
Which have nasty chemicals too.
Which are nasty chemicals, nasty process routes to derive them. So we've just got to get used to looking at things on a whole life cycle, holistic basis to check out, what is it from start point to finish point. And I mean, completely closed cycle so that everybody is satisfied.
You used a word that I hadn't heard before, process routes. That means what actually goes into actually creating them to begin with.
Yes, how you make it from, the moment you mine the original resource, refine it, put it through a manufacturing or what we call processing plant.
Yeah.
So it's that sort of thing.
And each of those process routes have waste streams as well, right? Because they require
absolutely.
chemicals to get things into their original position. Someday I have to do a calculation on this because I imagine, just given the incredible energy density of uranium, of nuclear fuel, which then is proportional to the output, the spent fuel or the waste, the volumes that we're talking about, I imagine just producing the paint on windmills has waste streams along the process routes that exceed that of nuclear fuel. It just based on kind of the orders of magnitude that we're dealing with, of what goes in.
Well,
in terms of the
I
energy
think
output out.
Certainly life cycle examination of waste streams of energy used to get you to a viable deployable product, whether it be a nuclear product or a wind product or a solar product, those sort of life cycle analyses are important. And there some are done, but they don't necessarily achieve the level of publicity, or they're quite complicated things to do, so they're not easy challenges to take on.
I know, because when people ask me about what about the waste, I say, well, what about the waste with anything? Because you have to view the entire life cycle of these things. But one of my fears is that the inputs to, let's say, when GE buys the chemicals that go into their carbon fiber turbine blades or something, we don't actually get accountability where all of the initial chemicals came from. They usually come from Russia or China, and some of those the chemicals that were used to make them just get dumped in a river or a stream somewhere and just are never accounted for. So I'm afraid that it's just never a fair fight when it comes to looking at this total life cycle comparison.
Yeah, it's true certainly that that hasn't been so in the past. I think, as time moves on, people are becoming much more aware of that sort of issue. And governments, departments of energy within governments generally have a reasonable feel for each of the energy sources. And therefore probably ought to be doing a better job at making those comparisons and making them available. I think as a society as well, and this is true internationally, not just in places like the UK or the United States, or society generally is much more aware of issues. Even in the developing world, because of the access to the internet, mobile phones, social media, that sort of thing, human beings want to live in a world where they're not polluting it, because everybody understands that when you pollute, it's not good for you or the whole of the global ecosystem.
Right.
So things like plastics, which didn't exist 100 or so years ago. When you've got a plastic island the size of France somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, it kind of brings it home to you that as a society, global society, we have to do much, much better as we move out in the decades of this century, if we're not going to leave our future generations of humans insurmountable issues to deal with.
So looking forward on that note, when we talk about new builds, what are some of the issues around new construction of nuclear power?
Some of the issues are to do with the amount of capital that you have to deploy in order to build the large gigawatt-size stations and the timeline over which that is deployed. and it's got to the point where it's very, very difficult for single private sector enterprises, no matter how big they are, to sustain that level of investment on their balance sheets. It's because nuclear is still perceived as, too risky for money to be loaned at modest interest rates. People still see the sector as a risk because a government policy could change. A government that said, yeah, we want 10 might be turning around and saying, well, actually, we're not sure whether we want any at all. So it's a really difficult investment landscape in the private sector. And what we haven't done, particularly in the Western world, latterly, is build stations efficiently and effectively. The nuclear part of the construction is actually not the major part of the construction because most of that takes place in factory and is shipped to site. The big issue is with the concrete and rebar and other infrastructure that goes around the nuclear bit, which is actually tiny in the overall scheme of things.
Yeah.
And so the failure of our designers to work with the construction sector to introduce much more modularity so that things can be built in factory, under roofs, not subject to weather interventions, and then move to site for the final assembly. We've got to get much better at that in order to reduce the cost base.
Do you see signs of that happening?
Yes, I do, yes. I mean, you saw the first signs with the design of the Westinghouse AP600, which evolved into the AP1000, which was the most modular of the modern plants. But even it ran into, construction issues at the plants in the United States, at Vogtle and VC Summer. And it's the best of the Western designed plants in terms of modularity. So we can do even better than that.
I like this idea of modularity. One of my fears in the Western world, though, is that construction costs for big infrastructure just balloon out of control. Even simple things like, I'm sure British designers wouldn't consider it simple, but the Bay Bridge, connecting San Francisco to Oakland, started off at $1 billion, ended up costing $6 billion. Started off only going to take a couple of years, ended up taking 10 years or so to build. Is part of the problem that these things are just too big to really take advantage of the modular construction techniques?
Yeah, the more you can move things into a factory environment and get the repeatability, the quality assurance, the regulatory inspection at factory is really important, because the more you have to do on site, making changes to design and fabrication on site with thousands of workers on site, that's just not going to be the way to do it going forward. It has to be more build it in factory reliably, robustly. And quite a bit of the construction sector is moving towards that. I mean, the shipbuilding sector moved towards that many decades ago. And, ships are much more in terms of modular build, where they're constructed and fitted in modules before final assembly, if you like. So it takes much less time. You get a much more robust and reliable products at the end of the day.
Are people looking towards the shipbuilding industry to adapt further techniques?
Absolutely. And that's one of the discussion points here in the UK as we move forward with our early plants in the new build fleet. And it's certainly one of the things that's being looked at with what's called small modular reactors to try and both get the robustness of the build and the timeline down. It's timeline as much as anything else, because if you're borrowing billions of dollars or pounds, if you're borrowing $8-10 billion or pounds, and it takes you 2 years longer than you thought, that's a massive impact on your return on investment and your cash availability in your balance sheet. So if you can shorten the timeline by going to modular build in factory, and you can reduce it to 36 to 48 months, that just changes the economic construct incredibly.
Can Western governments get involved from a financial perspective to kind of ease this interest rate burden issue?
They can. And we've yet to see whether that will materialise significantly. Because, if you look internationally at the nation states that are still continuing to build, they're building with a lot of state backing. So when you look at China, South Korea, Russia, even though private sector companies are involved in the build, the level of state backing to both request the fleet build approach and the things like loan guarantees, etc. That's visible there, whereas it isn't in some Western world countries. So your question is, should they be involved? And the answer to that is yes, because even with the difficulties of the plants that have gone ahead in more recent times, a lot of lessons have been learned in moving back to new build with better designs. And so the certainty of the design that are now internationally being built should give more confidence. And if governments take an interest, then the monies can be lowered significantly in terms of the interest rate that you pay to borrow the funds. So things like equity stakes, regulated asset models, guaranteed returns through contracts that are struck because the government buys a lot of energy in its estate, one way, shape or form. I'm not a financier, so, I can't give you the ideal way forward. But certainly I know that there are a number of models being looked at, and there isn't a single right answer. It will depend on the circumstances at the time.
Throughout your work at BNFL, you gained great leadership and authority in the UK nuclear community and even in the world community. What are some of the things that you've been focusing on lately? How do you spend your time now?
Fair bit of my time is now on the sort of topic we talked about. How do you engage the vendors better with the constructors before you start to pour concrete? And in the what we call the advanced modular reactors, the next generation reactors, how are we looking at the constructability and the factory manufacturability at the outset rather than build to print when the print might not be ideal for build, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So to really get a constructive dialogue between construction industry, which is moving forward in other sectors to be much more modern, much more 21st century, importing techniques like 3D printing, like much more robotics, much more robustness in the control and instrumentation side. So, we live in the 21st century, not the 20th century. And so making sure our designs are 21st century designs as they're finalised and closed out. Looking at the potential for things like high temperature reactors, which have the benefit over life water reactors that you've got heat output as well as electricity. So the dual mission, whereby you can couple them with energy intensive industries, or you can look in certainly urban areas at things like district heating, rather than, so you're not wasting the heat output that comes with those units.
Right. It's so funny because given that an equal share of our carbon emissions are from heat processes as they are from electricity. Yeah. And right now we're just throwing away the extra heat. Instead, you could replace the carbon based heat source and achieve your goals there, but then also sell the extra heat and make your plants more profitable at the same time and even reduce your overall electricity output cost. It seems like a double win to start taking advantage of that.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And, of the technologies that are offered as having great potential for the future, high temperature reactors certainly are probably closer to commercial reality than some of the other options. I mean, I'm always cautious about people who roll up that say, I've got this new reactor design that's, in the UK, we'd say it's the best thing since sliced bread. But I always go back to quotes from the famous Admiral Rickover, who said that, a paper design is always one that's better, cheaper, easier, but it's never actually been constructed. A design that's under construction is, often late. It's always harder. You face enormous technological challenges on things that you thought were solved. Yeah. And therefore, just be aware of those two competing lines. So people who come with PowerPoint presentations saying that they've got the best thing without all the validation, verification, and proving that goes with it, should be treated with, a great deal of suspicion, because we actually need to have the proof that the engineering is robust, that decades worth of development has preceded what's being offered, and that the things that are being offered will do better than the current light water reactors, which last for 80 years, which is pretty good.
Yeah, no, it is pretty good.
I'm very enthusiastic about advanced technologies, by the way. Most have been looked at in one way, shape or form, throughout the previous 6 decades. But mainly in national lab space, in various countries, if they haven't already been deployed. But the thing today is to utilise, as I said, 21st century technology to make the most of new materials, corrosion resistance, lifetime monitoring and measurement, so you can replace, making things easy to replace if they have to be replaced. Recognizing that probably things will have to be replaced, so designing so that they can be.
That's right.
Designing for decommissioning at the outset. Designing for waste minimization at the outset. Those are the sort of discussions that I'm involved in.
Yeah, it's so funny. I guess we do have to be careful when we say using modern technologies, because there are so many modern technologies that we can incorporate into nuclear power plant design. Other than just innovating on the core itself. For God's sakes, we have computer tools now to design things. Back in the day when these things were first designed, we didn't even have computers.
Yeah. The important thing is to have the validation and the verification that gives the regulator assurance, and everybody else assurance, hence. That if you are implementing a change, that it's a robust change that will be preferably beneficial and certainly not detrimental. So if it's a new manufacturing route like 3D printing, that the product you end up with still has the same performance in materials longevity, in robustness space as its predecessor that was made in a completely different way. So, a huge amount of understanding of materials, of microstructures, of their performance in different environments. I would say that as a materials engineer by birth, if you like. But those are the important features in research and development that are important.
Is there a bit of a chicken and the egg problems though? Because the way things used to be done, when safety wasn't as, I want to choose the right word here, when safety wasn't as integrated into the design process, across most technologies, the way that you would develop your codes is you would test something to failure, right? And that's how you figured out where the material limits would be. That's a cheap way to do it. It's a cheap and fast way to understand material characteristics, is you test something to failure. But you can't do that in the nuclear sector, because testing something to failure would mean a core meltdown. Is this driving a bit of a tension in our ability to do new materials testing in a timely manner in the nuclear sector?
A fair bit of it is to do with much better understanding of the interplay between microstructure, chemical composition, and the environment in which things sit. And we have much better analytical tools now to assess and make those judgments, and to look at timelines. Can you do a test in a year which will be good enough in prediction space to give you assurance for decades? So those are not unreasonable things to do and to request. So much better understanding of materials performance. That's true, but also not testing to fail, but given that you've got the same microstructure, the same chemical composition, it's just been made in a different way. We're a very, very conservative industry, so we'd normally ask for what are called lead test assemblies, or coupons, or things that you can test in real time that are not going to have a negative impact, so that when you do deploy, that you're confident, the regulator's confident, everybody is confident that it will perform as expected.
You've gotten a chance to see so much in your career in the nuclear space. That's probably led to some intuition and insight as to kind of where things are going down the road. Can you help paint the picture for how you see things playing out as we move forward?
Yeah, I think we still live in an era where nuclear will be seen as a positive resource to be used. I mean, it's an incredible energy resource. Arguably, one of the most sustainable resources ever gifted to humankind because of the amount of energy you get out of such a small amount of resource, and the fact that it is recyclable. So just from that perspective, I'm always positive about it. I think also because of the performance of the light water reactor fleet globally, which is incredibly robust and valuable, because of the desire globally to reduce carbon emissions and yet still live in an industrialized society with electricity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the reliability of those supplies are just so important to us now, more so than it was, say, 30, 40 years ago. Yeah. And so I just think the requirement for energy in a growing population, nuclear will have its role, a positive role, alongside the other renewable sources of energy. I always think of nuclear as a renewable source of energy because of the way it can be recycled. Other people don't necessarily think that, but I think nuclear in conjunction and in collaboration with renewable sources will provide humankind with a reliable, secure, sustainable source of energy for centuries, not just decades.
Thank you.